So why won't your Aussie native plant flower? Have you been caring for your Aussie native plant? Maybe it's a Restringia, a Syzygium, Callistemon, or a Coria, or some other native plant, and it's just not flowering, it's just not performing the way you really wanted it to. You've been meticulously caring for it, you've been trying to give it the water, you've been trying to give it sunlight, nutrients, just everything that it possibly needs, and it's just not performing the way you wanted it to. Maybe you feel like it's your fault, like you've done something wrong, but you just don't have the knowledge, or you just don't understand what the hell's going on here. Well, there are 13 reasons why this might be happening that I'm going to go over in this video. It's going to be a quick one. We're just going to really rush through each reason, and then if one of them strikes a chord, I'd recommend maybe having a look deeper into it. So do a bit of a Google search, or just go out there and have a look and just see what's going on. So the first one's going to be climate. So every plant has its own needs. So you wouldn't plant a tropical loving plant down in Tasmania, or vice versa. So stuff like humidity is going to play into things. Sometimes a plant really loves sunlight, and you put it in a shady spot, maybe beside the house. Maybe it only gets partial sunlight for part of the day. So have a look at that climate. Make sure every plant has its own temperature needs met, its own light needs met, rainfall, all that sort of stuff. We want to put the right plant in the right place. Because if it's not in the right place, it's not going to be getting those needs met. And that means that it's going to be just trying to survive. And flowering is really more of, it's a nice to have for a plant rather than a must have. So a lot of our native plants that we talk about are actually perennial plants. So, they're thinking maybe next year I can flower. This year I just need to hold on long enough, just survive, and maybe next year will be better, and then I can drop some of those seeds for the next generation. So soil will be the second reason why it's not flowering. Maybe you've got something like a kangaroo paw that really loves that sandy, free draining soil, and you've gone ahead and put it in clay. So it's constantly got wet feet. It's really just trying to get by. Again, it's not going to be able to give the energy into that flowering because it wants sand. So essentially what you can do is you can amend that soil. Maybe you could put some gypsum down on clay soil, or you could add some organic matter into a sandy soil if it's a clay loving plant and you've got it in sand. So you can try and amend that soil. At the end of the day, amending things can only do so much. So sometimes you're actually just much better off ripping that plant out, putting something in that's going to thrive in that space, something that's going to give you those flowers that you're really after. Sunlight would be the third reason. Maybe you have a plant planted at the side of the house and it's got, partial shade for most of the day, whereas it really wants full sun. Or the opposite, maybe it's something that it wants to be in shaded areas, and you've got it out in the full sunlight, and it really doesn't want to live like that. So make sure you understand the sunlight needs of your plant and make sure that those needs are being met. So the fourth reason is going to be water. Both underwatering, overwatering, they're both a really big problem in the landscape. So again, this can play into soil type in terms of how much water that soil is holding onto, or it can have more to do with the amount of water you're giving it. Maybe your sprinkler is going off too often. Maybe you need to down that water intake. Maybe it's just, it's got wet feet and it's not doing too well in that wet feet. Or maybe you're not watering it enough. It's a myth that all native plants are drought tolerant. That's actually not true. It's a massive country. There are a lot of different regions in Australia. Some of them had a lot more rain than have been in drought traditionally. So you're going to want to have those water needs met. Now, as a maintenance horticulturist, I've heard a lot of people saying, but I water it a couple of times a week, or I water it this much, or it's got absolutely nothing to do with the amount of times that you're watering it, for how long you're watering, or even how many liters of water you're putting on that soil surface. Have a look at that soil. Is the water just washing away down the gutter, or is it actually getting into the root zone? Because hydrophobicity, which is typical of sandy soils, when those sand particles, because they're so large, they can get coated in waxes, and then as the soil dries out, the organisms that are under the ground, they can't break down those waxes because they're just dead. There's no water in the soil to keep them alive. So over time, that wax builds up across the landscape, and then the water can't break through that layer of wax. And so you'll notice like water puddling on the top. And if you scratch across the surface and have a look underneath the soil surface, it's completely dry under there. So you can put thousands and thousands of liters of water on it. If it's just washing down the gutter, it's just a complete waste of time, complete waste of resources. And mulch is another reason why you can be preventing water from getting to the root zone as well. Particularly if you've got a really fine mulch without much, green material in it. If it's all brown material, again, that soil can be preventing water from going into the soil surface. Have a walk down to your park in the next few days, and next time you've had a good rain event in your town, just have a walk down to a local park and scratch across some of that that mulch, because a lot of the time you'll realize that, yeah, there's water getting onto the surface, but as soon as that water is hitting the mulch, it's just really getting absorbed into the top of the mulch or just rolling off again. It's not getting in beneath the mulch. And then you can be wondering, so why are these plants so dry and, losing all their foliage? They're defoliating. We've just had some water. Why are they still thirsty? Well, it's because that water's not getting below the soil surface. Clay can become compacted, particularly if it's been dry or if you've had cars driving over it or heavy foot traffic. Gypsum's probably the cheapest, easiest way to get that broken up without damaging the roots. You'll hear people talking about, yeah, you can dig up and break apart the clay like that. Yeah, the problem with that is that you're going to be damaging the root zone. So we really need to keep that root zone safe from those, from that damage of being hit by spades and stuff like that. Gypsum's going to break apart heavy clay without damaging that root zone. Organic matter, that's really the lifeblood of soil. So we're going to have stuff like compost. We're going to have stuff like that mulch. As long as the water's getting into the soil, it's going to be breaking down very slowly. Composted manure. Organic matter is really the lifeblood and the engine room of the soil. So all of those soil organisms, they're going to be breaking down the organic matter. They're going to be eating that compost. They're going to be eating that manure. They're going to be transporting nutrients into the root zone where the plant can access them. And organic matter also acts as a bit of a sponge when it comes to moisture. So you know how a sponge it can hold water, but it doesn't hold it too tightly. Whereas clay, it can really hold that water without letting it go. So it might be confusing, but organic matter can actually both hydrate water, or keep it hydrated rather, and it can also help it to become free draining, just like a sponge. Ausbreed have extensively tested a bunch of different plants in wet feet. So we've had some major rain events in New South Wales, and we actually tested quite a lot of plants in those. So a lot of plants didn't do well, but we found a few of them did. I'm not going to go into the research too much. You can just Google Ausbreed wet feet research, and you'll easily find that research, and you'll actually have a list of plants that do really well with wet feet. But a few callistemons that you wouldn't think would do really well in wet feet actually did. So we've got stuff like Slim callistemon, MacArthur callistemon, we had Better John callistemon, Green John callistemon did really well as well. And these are all plants that do really well with wet feet and also dry feet. So these are really good in stuff like rain gardens or bioswales where there are periods of drought, and then they need to be able to suck up that water really, really quickly, or be able to do well in extended periods of dry or wet. The fifth reason why your plants might not be flowering is that they may not have their nutritional needs met. And this is particularly true for native plants, because there's this persistent myth that Australian native plants don't like normal fertilizers and they need an Australian fertilizer mix or an Australian soil mix. Really, we're mainly talking about Proteaceae members when we're talking about that native fertilizer. So that's stuff like Banksias, Proteas, even though they're not an Australian native. They do get lumped in with Australian natives all the time. Stuff like Grevilleas. So these plants have a special type of root system. I'm not going to go into the details of that now, but they can't do well with high nutrient levels, particularly of phosphorus. So when we have our Australian natives in the Myrtaceae family, or a lot of, for example, like Correas and a lot of our native plants, just give them the normal fertilizer mix. They really do need those high levels of nutrients, contrary to popular opinion. So pruning can be a problem. If they're just about to flower and they're investing all this energy into these little flower buds, and then you come and prune them all off, well, that plant's just going to go, oh, okay, that was a waste of energy. Let's just get through this season and then maybe we'll focus on flowering next year. You might get a few flowers, but it's probably not going to flower the same amount if you've pruned it, after the flowering season. So every different native plant flowers at a different time. A lot of the time you're going to have stuff finishing flower in autumn or winter. Grevilleas, on the other hand, they're going to flower through winter, so they're going to be pruned in the warmer months. Give them a hard prune after they finish flowering and they'll come back stronger than ever. The seventh reason, we're going to be talking about pests and diseases. So, again, if they're having the lifeblood sucked out of them by aphids, or their leaves are being munched on by caterpillars or beetles or something like that, they're in survival mode. They're not going to be worrying about their progeny or trying to flower, because again, it's a nice to have, not a survival thing. So yes, they would love to spread those seeds, but if they can't do it this year, they're going to wait till next year. So have a look for your pests and diseases. I always recommend an integrated pest management approach to pests, just because spraying pesticides or fungicides and stuff like that can have really unintended consequences. Plants don't really exist in a vacuum. They actually make all sorts of friends with, mycorrhizal fungi, with beneficial insects. They actually exist in an ecosystem, and by preserving that biodiversity, we actually help the plants. And by killing things off and killing their friends off, we actually hurt them. The 8th reason will be root binding. So maybe your plants are still in a pot and it's been in a pot for a few years and you're like, oh, why isn't it flowering? Well, because those roots, they're binding it, they're strangling each other. They can't even pick out the water from the pot, let alone those nutrients. So get them out of the pot, have a look. If they're really spiraling, it sounds harsh, but you can kind of cut those roots back a little bit. Not something you want to do unless it's absolutely necessary, but a root-bound plant isn't going to survive anyway. Root binding doesn't only happen in the pot. It can happen after you've taken it out of the pot and then put it in the ground. If it was already root-bound from the nursery or because it's been sitting in that pot for too long, it's going to stay root-bound. So those roots aren't going to spread into the soil. Heavy clay soils, they can glaze on the side when you use an auger to dig a hole to put them in. That root binding will never really get better. It's basically in a pot anyway at that point. It's just the pot's made out of soil. Rocks, stuff like that, heavy clay soils, that's going to stop the roots from being able to spread out. So we like to dig a hole twice as wide and as deep as the root ball. And also we want to amend any heavy clay soils with something like a gypsum and organic matter as well if you can. So the 6th reason is going to be improper planting. So a lot of the time when we plant things in, we plant it too deep. So maybe you've dug a hole a little bit deeper than the root ball, then you put the plant in, and say the root ball's here, you're kind of brushing some of that soil over, and it's too deeply buried. That stem wants to be in the air. Remember, we want roots in the soil, stems in the air in general. So, if that stem is submerged, it's going to be host to some really serious pathogens, particularly fungal pathogens that just love that moisture. So we want to keep that stem in the air, and that goes for mulch too. So when you're mulching, just create a little well around that plant so that we're not burying it too deeply. So the 9th reason is going to be competition. A lot of the time we can plant, our native plants too close together. It's great when they're small because there's no gaps, and then as they get bigger, they sort of start to do a little bit less well. And the reason for that is that all these plants are all competing for nutrients with each other. So their roots are all growing around each other, which is great. We want the roots to grow around each other because they form little connections and they pass nutrients to each other through the mycorrhizae and stuff like that. But when they're too close together, there's just not enough to go around, and so everybody suffers. Or maybe it's only one plant in particular that suffers because it's a little bit weaker than the other one. It's kind of like in a human when there are two twins. If there's not enough resources, sometimes one of the twins are just going to outlive the other one just because it's a little bit stronger, and they're going to take all the resources for itself. And you'll have one of the plants that are bigger than the other one. 10th reason, stress. So just in general, just different kinds of stress. So we've talked about a lot of different kinds of stress so far in terms of nutrient stress, sunlight stress, climate stress. Maybe you planted something that really doesn't want to be planted near the salt, and you planted it on a coastal region. So you're getting that salty spray from the coast, and it's just like, dude, I hate salt. I cannot live in this area. So yeah, sometimes if it's a plant that's in the wrong place, cut it out. So maybe put a coria there, or a salt bush, or maybe a pig face, something that's going to really thrive in the area and that's not going to get stressed by the same causes of stress that the plant that you have there at the moment is being subjected to. The 11th reason is plant immaturity. Sometimes plants just take time to flower. I mean, you can't expect a plant grown from seed to flower in the first year every time. So this is particularly true of seed grown plants. So if you've got something like a cultivar that's grown by cutting, it's going to remember how old that cutting is. So it thinks it's a lot older than what it actually is. Or it actually is older than what you think it is. So it's going to remember how old it is. It's going to flower straight away as soon as it's established, as soon as it has everything it needs. It's like, well, I'm an 11-year-old plant, or I'm a 20-year-old plant. I'm ready to go, good to go. I don't need any more time. The 12th reason is that it's simply just the wrong time of year. So something like a callistemon, generally they're going to want to flower in spring. Grevilleas are going to flower in the colder months. Something like syzygium probably going to be in the warmer months. So you need to know what time of year they're going to flower. And you can't expect them to flower at the wrong time. You just need to actually understand what time of year your plants are going to flower and then plant accordingly. Like if you want flowers all year round, you're going to plant stuff that flowers all year round. So have your callistemons in the spring and have your syzygiums in the warmer months, and then you're going to have your grevilleas in the colder months. Just do a succession of flowering plants all throughout the year, and then you've got nothing to complain about because you're going to have all different types of plants, biodiversity, you're going to be able to support all kinds of pollinators throughout the whole year. And yeah, just going to be happy days. And the 13th reason is that you simply have the wrong plant in the wrong place. So again, a lot of these reasons are going to all link up with each other, but not all plants are going to thrive in your environment. Some plants are actually really fussy. So particularly stuff that haven't been bred very well, or even just native species. Like if you just go down to the bush and pick up a couple of seeds, not saying you should do that, by the way, that's probably illegal. They're not going to thrive. So they're going to have evolved in a certain way for certain conditions. Whereas if you go through a breeder like Aussie, who really focus on stuff that's going to really last in the urban landscape, you're going to be much better off. So I just want to go over a few flowering plants that are really, really, really strong in the urban landscape, that are no fuss, that are reliable, and that you can just trust to flower when they're going to. Firebell's Coria. So this one it's a beautiful little native ground cover. Perfect for small spaces. It's a ground cover, has some really hot looking reddish orange flowers, beautiful plant. Crimsonvillea grevillea is actually one of the most prolific winter flowering plants in the whole world. Not just Australian native plants, one of the best winter flowering plants in the whole world. Great for pollinators, really beautiful colour throughout those colder months. Just a great all-round Aussie native plant. Fluoroburst callistemon has hot fluoro pink coloured bottle brush flowers, really beautiful in spring. Just a great all-round Aussie native plant. Blue Gem Westringia is a hybrid Westringia. It's actually one of the most vivid flowering Westringias. Flowers profusely in spring and also at other times of the year. It has beautiful blue coloured flowers. Aussie Rambler Carpobrodus. This is a pig face, does great on coastal areas. Really good ground covering plant. Succulent stems up to 2 meters long. Does really well unless you're putting it on a steep slope. If you put it on a steep slope, it can actually start to slide down that slope just because it's so heavy and the root system isn't really that tough. So really good on flatter areas, maybe a little bit of a slope, but nothing that's too steep. This pig face flowers through spring and autumn. Mima Hardenbergia. This one flowers for a lot longer than most Hardenbergia cultivars or even the native species. It's really compact, does well even if you don't prune it. It sort of keeps its shape. You can use it as a climber or as a ground cover. Beautiful purple flowers from July to September. Now I've saved the best till last. Pink Fusion Scaevola is a fan flower. It's really probably one of the best native plants that have ever been bred, just in terms of its versatility. I mean, it'll grow in basically any kind of soil, anywhere pretty much in Australia. It flowers for almost the whole year round. It can flower for the whole year round as long as it's happy, and is very rarely unhappy. It's probably the toughest Aussie native that's ever been bred. Now we've really raced through these reasons why your Aussie native plants might not be flowering. If you're a little bit unsure still, have another listen to this video and maybe just go outside and have a look. Dig your finger into the soil, have a look at the conditions, research about what types of conditions that your plant really wants to live in, and just sort of go from there. It might be time that you just cut it out and replaced it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with cutting an Aussie native plant out, as long as you replace it with something that's going to thrive in the space instead.